Hey guys, welcome to this week's episode of Recovery Talk. So for this week, I wanted to talk about weighing yourself in recovery. Is it necessary? Is it harmful? Is it helpful? And I kind of want to start off by acknowledging that this is a sensitive topic, okay? I think for a lot of people with eating disorders or with past of eating disorders, the scale is more than just a tool to measure their relationship with gravity, right? Which is technically what it is, right? Instead, it becomes something very symbolic, right? It becomes something that represents the eating disorder. It becomes something that they're attached to and find it difficult to let go of. It also can become an object of quite a lot of hatred, right? Because it represents that torture, it's a torture tool of the eating disorder. And I always try and keep this in mind when I talk about the scale, right? I can sometimes get very objective about certain things, right? And just a little bit too robotic and objective and a little bit too sciencey. So I sometimes just try and keep in mind that this is a highly emotional and sensitive topic for a lot of people. So let's get started. What should you do in eating disorder recovery? Should you weigh yourself? Should you just throw the scale out or maybe smash it with the hammer? What should you do? So here is the thing. I think that for the vast majority of people in eating disorder recovery, weighing yourself is not necessarily and can actually be harmful. Then again, there is also a small group of people where the scale may need to have a necessary role, and I'll explain why in a bit. So, why do I think that the majority of people with eating disorders don't need to weigh themselves in recovery? The reason for this is pretty simple. Most people with eating disorders are not necessarily dangerously underweight. They may be a bit underweight relative to their body set point weight range, but very often what they find is that as they let go of the eating disorder rules and start actually eating what they want, whenever they want, increasing their intake, going with their bodies, their body will naturally find their set point weight range and settle there. They rationally know that they are gaining weight in recovery, so it's not like they need the scale to make sure they're gaining weight. Instead, weighing yourself in recovery, if you fall into this group, you may tell yourself it is to make sure you're gaining weight, but you are gaining weight, and you can also maybe tell in different ways. Maybe you can tell that your clothes don't fit, your old sick clothes don't fit anymore. And yes, there is a chance that you will feel like you are gaining a lot more weight than you actually are, People with eating disorders will gain a tiny amount and be convinced their weight restored. We know that there's nuance here, right? But overall, if you are someone who is in recovery and you know that you are gaining weight, you know that you are eating a sufficient amount, a generous amount in recovery, you know that you're resting, you know that your body is naturally working at getting you to your set point weight range, then chances are you don't need to weigh yourself. You may tell yourself, I need to weigh myself to make sure I'm gaining weight, but you already know you're gaining weight, right? And actually what very often happens is people tell themselves that they are weighing themselves in recovery to make sure they're gaining weight, when actually what they're doing is weighing themselves in recovery to make sure they're not gaining quote unquote too much or too fast. But the truth is there is no such thing in recovery. Your body has a natural set point weight range that it will work to get you towards. So I want you to be honest with yourself. If you fall into this group where you know very well that if you're letting go, that you're increasing your intake and going for, I guess some people call it all in recovery, that you know that your weight is gonna go up and stabilize in your set point weight range, then chances are weighing yourself is not necessary and you can just throw out the scale. And then there is the people who don't fall into this group. So let me use myself as an example. So now I'm going to describe a phenomena that happens to some people in recovery, and the people it happens to, it is often but not always people with anorexia nervosa who are quite underweight. Please remember that not everyone with anorexia is underweight, and please also remember that not everyone this happens to is necessarily severely underweight, right? But I'm just going to explain a phenomena that happens to some people when they're under their set point weight and they start recovery. So when I started recovery, I was quite underweight and I had to increase my intake, obviously. And in the beginning, this was easy breezy. I mean, not mentally, but physically was easy breezy because I was so hungry. But then as time went by, I was eating a quite generous recovery intake. And that felt, for me, I was very full on that intake, but I was not putting on any weight. I did not weigh myself at home, but I went to weekly weigh-ins, right, at the outpatient eating disorder clinic. And they were essentially telling me, hey, your weight gain has stopped. And I was still underweight. I knew deep inside that I was not naturally severely underweight. I knew that. I could have tried to convince myself that. I could try and use the language of intuitive eating and blah, blah, blah to justify this. But thank God I didn't, and thank God my team didn't. Essentially what had happened is that my body had gotten used to the higher intake and the metabolism had sped up. Also, what happens in a lot of people with anorexia is that when they start eating more again, the leptin levels reach the normal values before the weight is normalized. So basically, leptin levels, which is a hormone controlling appetite, controlling weight gain, normalizes prematurely in some people with anorexia. And this can complicate weight gain because essentially your metabolism is high and your appetite is adjusted to this intake that is higher than your restrictive intake, but still not high enough to restore weight. If you were to just eat intuitively at this point, then chances are you would end up not eating enough to restore weight. Additionally, a lot of people experience delayed gastric emptying, which can make them feel full quicker. So overall, here you have several factors making someone who's underweight feel quite full and feel like, well, if I'm just gonna eat intuitively and let my body sort it out, then they will stay at an underweight weight. This is not their set point weight range. I would say that this is a minority of cases, and the people that this most often happen to are people with anorexia nervosa who enter recovery and increase their intake at a low weight. There is a bit of a thing that, this is something that often happens inpatient. And obviously it's not the power of the hospital walls that make this happen. The reason why this tends to happen more often inpatient than outpatient is simply because inpatient people are forced to eat more and rest. I wasn't inpatient, but I was outpatient and I was pretty stubborn in my recovery. So when they told me, hey, you need to rest and eat more, I actually did it. Whilst outpatient, a lot of people in recovery, they're kind of restricting and then they had a bit of a relapse and then they have one day where they're doing recovery and then, it's just like a cycle. And this doesn't allow for the metabolism to speed up, doesn't allow for the normalization of these hormones. And this is why you can see a lot of people getting quote unquote weight restored whilst eating very little and while still engaging in restrictive behaviors because they're still in, the starvation mode where their body is heavily prioritizing weight gain, which is a protective state, right? Because weight gain is not a negative. And the state that I was in, I understand the disordered part of people would see that as desirable. Like, oh, you're eating a lot of food and maintaining a low BMI. This looks like the dream. And then use that as a motivation to increase. God, the amount of times I have people who want to work with me so I can quote unquote fix their metabolism. And then, I do that because it's not really that difficult. And then they end up maintaining a low weight at a higher intake, and then getting them to move from that quasi stage into full recovery can be challenging. They think they have the best of both worlds. They're like, I'm eating more, but I'm maintaining a low weight. Truth is, you're not getting the best of anything. You're just getting, your body's still sick, your brain is still sick. And the reason why your brain is still sick is because that resistance towards entering a weight that's good and healthy for your body is in itself the eating disorder. You can't be recovered while still controlled by the eating disorder. And equally, even though my body struggled putting on weight at this point, I still needed to put on weight. I was not necessarily as someone who's naturally severely underweight. That's just not my body type. And for 99% of people, that is not their natural body type either. Yes, I am someone who's naturally on the slimmer side, I guess, but I'm not someone who's naturally super underweight. So in this very case, it was necessary for me to have my team track my weight once a week to make sure that it was going up so that when it didn't, they could tell me, hey, your weight gain has stopped and now we need to increase you. What I would recommend is if you are in this group, if you fall into the group where realistically you know that you need to gain weight, but it's not necessarily just happening by you eating more. Maybe you experience hypermetabolism, maybe you just experience very early fullness, whatsoever. By the way, if you're experiencing early fullness, check out the episode I did called Not Hungry. I did it quite a while ago, so you might need to browse a bit throughout my old episodes, but it's called Not Hungry and it talks about appetite loss in recovery. Anyways, and if you fall into this group, there are, of course, other ways than to weigh yourself to make sure you're gaining weight. But it could be that you are overestimating how much weight you're gaining. Like, I can reassure you, when I was in this stage and I looked myself in the mirror, I was like, yeah, I look completely normal now. Because I'd gotten so used to the very, very underweight body that the body that was still underweight but slightly bigger, for me, just looked completely normal. If anything, I was like, ooh, I got some curves back. Like, come on. Like, when I look at pictures of myself or how I looked like back then, I was like, whoa, you look sick. You actually look sick. You look unwell. But I generally thought I was looking normal, right? I did not see that I looked sick at that point. So if I were to just go with, oh, I feel normal, therefore I am normal, I would have stayed at that weight. So if you are falling into this group, having blind weigh-ins, I would recommend that over seeing your number. You can maybe make an agreement with your doctor that your doctor is keeping a track to make sure you are gaining weight. That is the only reason as to why weigh yourself in recovery, is to make sure you're gaining weight. It is not to make sure you're not gaining quote unquote too much too soon, because there is no such thing. It is literally just to make sure you're gaining weight and make sure that you're gaining sufficient amount of weight, because sometimes people are like, oh yeah, I'm gaining like 200 grams a week. That is nothing. If anything, that's just fluctuations. If you have an agreement with a doctor or psychologist that they can do a blind weigh-in where you don't see the number and they can just give you a heads up when or if weight gain has stopped without letting you know exactly how much you weigh, then you may find that to be helpful. And if you don't want to do that with a health professional, some people also do it with a parent. I've had this with a few clients where I work collaboratively with their team and also with the parents, where the parent will do the blind weigh-ins, just looking at their weight to make sure that the weight is going up. And then if it has stopped, then they will reach out to me and the team. And then if it's been, stopping and we're kind of like, well, you stalled out now, then what tends to happen is the dietitian, because again, I like to work with the whole team. The dietitian will then increase the intake and we will work on, getting in more food. So for some people in recovery, this is necessary. But for, I would say, the majority of people, it is not, because for the majority of people, their body will kind of just sort it out. And some people may notice that it depends, right? They may have had one time where they did recovery where their body was just sorting it out. Maybe they had extreme hunger, so it made it a lot easier. And then they're trying recovery again, and they're like, well, this time around, I have no appetite. And I understand the resistance to force feeding yourself or forcing a weight up. I understand the resistance towards it. And unfortunately, I sometimes feel like recovery spaces and certain people in the recovery community is almost reinforcing this, because they are portraying intuitive eating as like the holy grail, right? It will sort everything, will solve everything. But the truth is that sometimes you need to force feed yourself and sometimes you need to force your body to gain weight. If you are not so lucky that your body is going to sort itself out with more food, which many bodies does, but not everybody, then you may have to force feed yourself. You may have to eat too far beyond the point of fullness, and you might have to force your body to gain weight. And making sure this is actually happening could be necessary to look at a scale. But I would also recommend, if you can, it shouldn't be you looking at that scale. If you can have someone else take that part of responsibility so that you don't attach or overanalyze the numbers, then that can be very helpful for you. There are, of course, also some people who don't necessarily are too bothered by the scale. They don't find it too triggering. I've had some clients where the scale, they don't have that difficult of a relationship to it, and they find that weighing themselves to make sure they're gaining weight is actually not something that bothers them. If so, I tend to work with gradually reducing the weigh-ins, right? So for example, someone may be like, okay, I've been weighing myself once a week, and then it's like, okay, well, now let's move it over to twice a week, once a month, and then completely stop weighing yourself totally. And instead, if there is that fear, like, oh, what if I lose weight and don't realize, we agree on certain red flags, like, oh, if you notice, for instance, your pants start fitting looser, right? I would strongly recommend, when navigating this, I would recommend working with an eating disorder experienced therapist or coach or doctor whatsoever that has knowledge and can help you make a plan that is individualized to you. I see this so often with clients where, especially clients who go through this thing that I experienced, where actually their quote-unquote intuitive eating just doesn't take them to a sufficient amount to gain weight. And they will look at Instagram and they look at intuitive eating and you letting your body find its own set point weight, which is true. It will that eventually, right? But their body's not doing that right now. And then they're like, oh, well, I don't want to force feed myself. That's unnatural. I want to do intuitive eating. And then their team will be like, hey, we need to get your weight up now, right? So I just wanted to offer that nuance, right? And I know that this can be unpopular because in some ways it goes against some of the messaging around, I guess, intuitive eating. And intuitive eating is a crucial tool. It is what you eventually want to move towards. But sometimes mechanical eating has to come before intuitive eating. And sometimes pushing the weight up has to come before your body actually finds a set point weight and then stabilizes there. And I know what a lot of you are going to ask now is, but how do I know if I'm at my set point weight? How do I know if I should push the weight up? What if I push the weight up above my set point weight, etc., etc.? I will make an episode about this, but we got to cover one thing at a time here. And in this episode, I want to talk specifically about the scale. One thing I want to remind people about the scale is that it is supposed to fluctuate, right? So a lot of times people weigh themselves like every day and then they panic when there is a fluctuation. But the truth is, that's how human bodies work. Our weight is supposed to fluctuate throughout the day, throughout the week, throughout the month. That is just how our bodies work. It has to do with how much food is in your stomach system. Maybe you just eaten, maybe you just had a glass of water, right? If you have a glass of water, let's say 200 milliliters of water, right? That weighs around like 200 grams, right? If you drink that, it will still weigh 200 grams inside your body, right? The weight doesn't disappear once it's inside you. Equally, we also have different amounts of water we hold from day to day. Some days we hold a lot of water. This can be several kilos of difference on the scale. Other times we hold less water. I've spoken about water retention and how to spot it in a previous episode titled Water Retention, so just check that out. Geez, I feel like I give so many shout outs to my previous episodes. But the reason for this is that I have a lot of episodes and I have a lot of people asking, can you talk about this? Can you talk about that? When I already have an episode about it. So definitely recommend you to check out previous episodes and see what I've covered in the past. Another thing that I want to remind people about is that our weight is actually supposed to fluctuate throughout our lives. Like the body you have when you were 15 is not supposed to be the same body you have at 35. We all have a set point weight range, but this is a range, so our body may fluctuate a bit on the higher and lower end of that. And equally with recovery, it's very, very common and actually beneficial to experience an overshot, which basically means that after recovery, your body will tend to prefer being in the higher end of the set point weight range. It makes complete sense. It's been starved, so you kind of want to hold on a bit, you know? You just got to give your body a lot of food, a lot of rest, and a lot of time so it learns to trust you again. And it will eventually stabilize at your set point weight range. I think the key takeaway from this episode is, personally, as a coach, someone who works with people in eating disorder recovery, I would recommend not weighing yourself unless you absolutely have to for medical reasons. And if you have to for medical reasons, I would recommend, if possible, having a health professional or maybe a parent or someone else that can do it for you and do blind weigh-ins. I do not believe that you need to be exposed to that number. I have some disagreement with a lot of people in my field who always say, well, not always, but a lot of times say, oh, but you have to get exposed to that number as exposure therapy. What is very interesting is the people who say that tends to be the people in the field who don't have lived experience with eating disorders. I don't think I've ever heard a practitioner with lived experience of an eating disorder say that you need to expose yourself to that number. This is not to say that practitioners without lived experience aren't great. There's so many amazing practitioners who haven't had an eating disorder, still are very knowledgeable, but it is an interesting observation. And I think that the reason why they're thinking this is because this whole rule of exposure therapy applies to everything else in recovery, or pretty much everything else. We talk about fear foods, the importance of exposing yourself to fear foods. You're exposing yourself to something difficult, right? And therefore it becomes easier. So then I think the logical conclusion a lot of practitioners say is, well, then you of course need to expose yourself to the number on the scale because this gives discomfort, right? My argument against this is that the scale is not something that is important or you need to be exposed to live a good life. But food is, including fear foods. I honestly think that you can spend the rest of your life, and of course, unless there are medical situations coming up where you have to track your weight, right? But I think that most people can live pretty much their whole life without stepping on a scale and be perfectly healthy. But I believe that equally, most people can't avoid foods and be healthy, right? I don't necessarily think you need to expose yourself to doing something that normal people don't really even have to do. Normal people don't have to go weigh themselves all the time. Nobody says that. Then why does a person with an eating disorder need to do that, right? I just don't see the reason for it. unless it is medically necessary and agreed upon. Exposure therapy is something you're doing because not doing this activity limits you, right? So for example, I've done exposure therapy for my claustrophobia, and the reason why I do this is because the alternative is living with the claustrophobia and fear that limits me. So having, for example, I have a huge fear of being stuck on a tube or in a car or in traffic. That fear is actually harming me because not doing that, not being able to go into a car, go into a tube, limits my life. But not weighing yourself, does that limit your life? No. If I ask my family, hey, do you guys weigh yourself? They're going to be like, no. Because it's not something that's important to do to live a full life, right? And often the reasoning behind weighing oneself is a fear of weight gain, right? So the underlying drive to do that behavior is in itself disordered. I don't own a scale. I don't weigh myself. I think the only times I've weighed myself has been in medical situations because I got chronic illness and they put me on and take my weight and height a lot of times for, dosage of medications, etc., etc. But even if you are in this situation, you know that you can actually ask for blind weigh-ins. You can ask for them not to show you the number. For me, I just not really bothered. It doesn't trigger me, doesn't bother me. It's literally just the numbers. I haven't really said anything, but you can do this. So yeah, I know that people are gonna disagree with this, or some people may agree, some people disagree with this, that thinking that you should see the number, that should be okay. But it's very interesting because now, as I mentioned, I have at times seen my weight because there's been in some medical documents, etc., etc., and it hasn't really bothered me. I didn't come to that point by weighing myself. I came to that point by not weighing myself and instead finding value in other things and finding trust in my body. And I see this a lot. The clients that I work with who don't weigh themselves and then suddenly they're faced with their weight on like some kind of medical document, very typical example. They often say that they're not that bothered, even though they haven't been practicing by weighing themselves. They haven't practiced and exposed that fear of seeing that number. They've actually done opposite. So it kind of is the opposite thing compared to exposure therapy, right? Because if I am to avoid cars, I will get more scared of cars. But I find that with weight and seeing the number, it actually works the opposite way around. Again, I know some people may disagree, some people may have different experiences, and I completely I understand that, right? I'm just saying based on my experience and the experience of a lot of people that I have worked with. Anyways, guys, I hope you enjoyed this episode and found maybe some insight in it. I know it is a controversial topic. I know it's a topic with a lot of different opinions, a lot of different strategies. I also know a lot of people have had very, very negative experience with the scale and being weighed by medical professionals, or overemphasis on the number and feeling like all they care about is the number and not the behaviors. And I want to say that there's so much more to recovery than weight. Of course, weight gain is an important part, but of course you also need to rewire and focus on those beliefs, right? But I also think that if you are someone who's underweight and undernourished, you can't think your way out of an eating disorder. You need to act yourself out of it. And you can't fully recover from an eating disorder unless you are within your body's healthy, natural set point weight range. So to kind of go back a bit to my experience here, when I actually pushed up the weight and pushed it over the, underweight limits and pushed it into the normal weight range, well into the normal weight range, I noticed that there was a cognitive shift. It was so strange. It was not something that was a result of therapy. It was actually more like it was like something switched off in my brain or on. I don't know if it was on or off, but I suddenly noticed I felt far less rigid. I felt far more present. And that happened due to the state of being weight restored and refed and staying that way over time, and my body realizing, hey, you're at a comfortable weight for your body. Hey, there is no famine coming. So please don't underestimate the cognitive shifts of weight restoration, and please don't forget the component of weight restoration. An eating disorder is not a weight disorder. Being underweight is a side effect in some, but not all cases. In those cases where it is a side effect that must be corrected. Okay guys, I'm going to answer a listener question. And the listener question goes, how do you eat when you have stomach pain and it feels so wrong? So I have answered this question a bit more in depth in the episode about not being hungry in recovery, and also about the episode on stomach problems, tummy troubles in recovery. But I think the most helpful thing to remind yourself is that the reason why you feel this pain and it feels wrong, it is not recovery's fault. It is actually the eating disorder's fault. So often when people are in recovery and start out recovery, they notice that their stomach will hurt. They feel bloated. They feel, they just don't feel great, right? And then they're thinking, well, this just shows recovery is not for me because I feel worse now. But here's the thing. The reason why you feel this pain and discomfort is because it is basically a delayed reaction to the damage done by the eating disorder. For example, stomach pain in recovery. This heavily ties into essentially when you are severely restricted, right? What happens is your body slows down every function, including your digestion. So a delayed gastric emptying, basically the food stays in your stomach and system for longer. This can make you feel like you get quite a tummy ache. You can feel overly full. Often people feel full but not full, and hungry but not hungry, where their stomach may feel stuffed, but they can't stop thinking about food. So basically, food is staying longer in your stomach, which makes you feel a bit bloated, nauseous, unwell. Some people may experience constipation. And this is not recovery's fault. This is the eating disorder's fault. And essentially, the solution is to give your body more energy so it can correct the energy deficiency that caused this in the first place. So when you feel this discomfort, when you feel this pain, take this as a sign of the damage done by the eating disorder. Take it as a motivation to give your body the energy to correct it. I hope that was helpful, and I really look forward to seeing you guys next week. And again, I also want to say thank you for, I feel like I say this every episode, but I'm such a Pisces. I get very I get so happy when I see people being so nice and sending me messages or emails or, saying so many nice things about podcasts, sharing it on their stories and spreading the word. It genuinely means a lot to me. I really am trying to get back to people, but it is just not always possible. Please don't think that means that I don't care. I really do care. And I'm so grateful for you all for, tuning in and being such supporters of this podcast. I didn't expect so many people would enjoy it when I started it. It was kind of just something I started, on more like a smaller scale. Didn't really market it that much or anything, but it's kind of just been growing and spreading organically, which I think is so nice. And I love having it as a free science-based resource for people who have eating disorders or just people who want to know more. I know that there are health professionals listening, there are parents listening, partners, and I think that is so, so cool. So I really hope you are enjoying. Okay, guys, now I will leave you guys to it. Have a wonderful day and see you guys next week.